So is China harvesting people's organs before they're even in a brain dead status or they're unable to take care of themselves? In this video, there's a guy that had escaped from his hospital in Jianyou County, Puqian City, Fujian Province, China, on December 26th of 2024. It's been reported that while he was unknowingly waiting to have his organs forcibly harvested, a nurse who felt sorry for him secretly informed of his fate. He then escaped by climbing out of a window and was screaming in agony, desperately pleading for help and asking anybody that was outside walking by if they would help him. He was screaming things like, "Help! They want to take my life! Help! They want to take my life! Somebody help me!" He was like screaming, and a bunch of passerbys and onlookers just stared at him while he was up there on the ledge, begging for his life. Organ harvesting has been a hot topic that a lot of people brought up about China, specifically in the Chinese Communist Party, and I don't really know a whole lot about it, but I do know that there was a Congressional Executive Commission on China that did a live stream about organ harvesting back in the spring of 2024. And I want to hear some of the things that they said, because I think it's pretty wild, some of the things that they're stating have been happening that Congress has released to the public for us to know as well. So let's give this a listen.
Press is one of the most persistent, horrific human rights abuses of our time, but sadly one which has not received widespread attention and scrutiny and condemnation that it absolutely deserves. Almost 2 years ago, Sir Jeffrey Nies testified before a hearing I chaired on forced organ harvesting in the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. For those who don't know, Sir Jeffrey was the lead prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He is a serious man who engaged in a serious attempt to investigate the evidence of forced organ harvesting as the chair of the Independent People's Tribunal into forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in the People's Republic of China, or simply they called it the China Tribunal.
So imagine for a moment, like, just going along your day, you get hurt and then you're in the hospital. You're just there to get treated. And then they decide, you know what? Let's take this guy's organs. Not like, oh, this guy is brain dead and he's like, you know, let's consult with his family and ask them if, like, hey, are you guys okay with, you know, pulling the plug on this guy because his brain dead anyway, and like we really need some kidneys and a liver and a heart transplant for some other patients here, and we could really use this stuff to help. No. Like, I'm talking like harvesting organs for like other nefarious purposes.
That day, the final judgment of the China Tribunal, and he put it this way: the tribunal found unanimously and sure beyond a reasonable doubt that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been a practice for a substantial period of time, including a substantial amount of victims.
What is a prisoner of conscience? Prisoner of conscience is someone who is imprisoned or otherwise restricted for their beliefs or identity, but who has not used or advocated violence. Amnesty International defines a prisoner of conscience as someone who is imprisoned for their political, religious, or other conscientiously held beliefs, ethnic origin, sex, color, language, national or social origin, socioeconomic status, birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. So basically political prisoners, because like none of that stuff is stuff you can be persecuted for here in the United States, but that's not the same situation in China and other places like Afghanistan, for example, or Iran. Let's keep going and see what else he has to say.
Among those victims, he said, there were most certainly the most vulnerable populations in China today: prisoners, Falun Gong practitioners, and Uyghurs. Forced organ harvesting on an industrial scale in China is an atrocity unmatched in its wickedness, one that has to go back to the horrific crimes committed in the 20th century by Hitler, Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot to find a comparably systematic type of atrocities. The number of those executed or for their organs, some even before they were brain dead, is staggering. Thus, the China's tribunal final assessment was that state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting in China amounts to, quote, crimes against humanity.
Yeah, that's absolutely crimes against humanity. You're just executing people to take their organs. Now, who's to say where these organs are being sold? Are they being sold in the black market? Are they being sold public sector or the private sector? According to the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, a individual wrote an article that said that Falun Gong practitioners in 2006 were being forced to undergo live organ harvesting in China, effectively being murdered in the process of organ procurement. David Mata Wallace and David Kilgore, both Canadian attorneys and human rights activists, led an investigation that uncovered 41,500 unaccounted for organ transplants from 2000 to 2005. 41,500 unaccounted for organ transplants in 5 years. These transplants did not have identifiable donor sources, such as willing family members or brain-dead donors, suggesting that transplanted organs could have come from prisoners of conscience. So apparently he came from a rural village in Shandong province and was repeatedly detained and tortured between 1999 and 2004 for practicing Falun Gong, which is a spiritual practice rooted in Buddhist traditions. The Chinese Communist Party, which views Falun Gong as a threat to its authoritarian rule, has branded Falun Gong a dangerous cult and has systematically persecuted its adherents for decades. Apparently, when he was inside of a car in Washington, D.C., he said, "One day in 2002, I was told to pack up and was suddenly transferred to Harbin Prison and later to Daqing Prison. It was there that I was tortured even more severely." He was tortured to the point of losing consciousness. During his imprisonment, Cheng was subjected to forced blood tests, an ominous indicator of his organs' viability for transplantation. "They did blood tests on me many times and subjected me to all kinds of inhumane torture," he noted. The torture in prison was very systematic. One was mental and the other was physical. Mentally, they put me and my family members under pressure as they wanted me to give up my faith in Falun Gong, and if I didn't, they would force my wife to divorce me when I was in prison. He was told that if his wife did not divorce him, she would face similar persecution as he was facing. That's crazy. This is like the kind of stuff that people are not talking about. After hours of excruciating torture, known as the Big Stretch, during which his limbs were painfully stretched from all corners, Cheng swallowed a rusty nail and a blunt blade he had found in the torture room. Oh my god, dude. Despite not showing immediate signs of ill health, he was forcibly taken to the hospital on November 16th of 2004. His family was informed that there was an 80% chance of mortality associated with the operation, supposedly to remove the objects he had swallowed. They said that I had to undergo an operation, but I firmly refused. They held me down and gave me an injection. I quickly lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital and I felt terrible pain in my side. There was a bloody tube connected to me. I was shackled to my bed. Bro, this is what a horror story, dude. What an absolute horror story. So he was shackled to his bed with an IV tube taped to his foot, a drainage tube in his left chest, oxygen tubes in his nose, and a 35-centimeter incision on the left side of his chest. Typically, the removal of such objects would have been done via endoscopy, but Cheng had undergone open chest surgery. The doctors and several of the 610 office officials were there, he recalled. Now, the 610 office is notorious for secretive and powerful organizations within the CCP, and they're usually tasked with implementation of cracking down on the Falun Gong. Oh my god, dude. Following the forced surgery, he was returned to detention at Daqing Prison, where he experienced severe shortness of breath and fatigue. Despite enduring ongoing torture by prison guards for his refusal to renounce Falun Gong, he stayed there and stayed true to his faith. In March of 2006, he began a hunger strike and was subsequently transferred to Daqing Longnan Hospital. After arrival, a sister was present and witnessed Cheng being shackled to a hospital bed. A prison guard informed his sister that Cheng had supposedly ingested a knife and that the surgery required to remove it had an 80% mortality rate. This is the second time the family had been given such information, but this time neither Cheng nor his family were asked to consent to the operation. Now, for this particular operation, Cheng maintained that he did not swallow any object and had no medical condition necessitating surgery before being forcibly taken to the hospital. He believed that the authorities were planning to take his life. That night before the scheduled surgery, Cheng requested to be unshackled to use the restroom across the hall. Upon his return, the guard forgot to reshackle him and fell asleep, inadvertently providing him with an opportunity to escape via the hospital's internal fire stairs. Bro, I can imagine most people would try to escape after this. He said, "I noticed the fire escape on my way on the restroom. I knew where it was, so I could use this to try to escape out of the hospital. I ran downstairs and called a cab in front of the hospital and quickly went out of the area into Tianjin City." After this, he escaped as a refugee to Thailand, where he stayed in a United Nations refugee camp. After dramatic escape from China and a lengthy 9-year period of evading the authorities, Cheng made it to the United States in 2020. Once in the US, he underwent a series of medical tests that confirmed his worst fears. Segments of his liver and a portion of his left lung had been surgically removed. At that time, I didn't realize that it was organ harvesting. After undergoing medical tests, I found out that my organs had been harvested. Part of my liver and lungs had been removed. I didn't even know about it until I was examined in the US. Transplant specialists have confirmed through recent CT CT scans that Cheng was missing segment 2 and 3 of his left liver lobe, as well as the lower left lobe of his lungs. And these findings, along with a detailed report on his case, were presented to a panel in Washington, D.C. Now, I think the reason why they picked the liver is because apparently, according to numerous sources online, the liver can return to its normal size within 8 to 12 weeks after surgery or partial removal, which leads me to believe that a lot of people that are being targeted by this probably get targeted for liver because you can remove a large portion of it and keep them alive and give them another year to recover, and then it'll grow back to normal size. That doesn't make it right. It's still disgusting, but that's probably one of their thought processes in the matter. Anyway, let's continue back with the Congressional Executive Commission on China and their discussion on organ harvesting.
I mean, you talk about they are just incredibly cruel in how they mistreat people. In the 1990s, Chinese doctors, nurses, security guards came forward again to describe all of this. Today, I'm announcing an initiative to seek firsthand witnesses' information on forced organ harvesting in China. We hope that people will come forward and tell their stories. They will do it with anonymity to protect their identities and those of their loved ones, and we are absolutely committed to that. But we need that information to build this case further. When we passed the bill last March that went over to the Senate, the Chinese embassy here in Washington claimed it was all lies, completely repudiated it from their point of view. And they also said anybody who wants to come to Xinjiang, we have nothing to hide. This was said separately, but they said it there as well. This is an ongoing fight to demand transparency and justice and an end of this egregious human rights abuse. If we don't act now, many more lives will be lost. And I thank you, and I can't thank our witnesses enough for being here and for throughout the year and years being the source of so much credible, actionable information that has enlightened what we do on this commission. I'd like to turn to my good friend and colleague.
I'll focus on recent developments today, specifically the CCP's systematic harvesting of Uyghurs and other Turkic groups. Just as the rise of China's transplant system was built on the persecution of Falun Gong, harvesting is now bound to the Xinjiang camp system constructed from 2016 to 2018. Also use this as an opportunity to respond to the CRS casting a little shade on witness statement. So Congressman Smith, please forgive the repetition with previous testimonies in this case. But I will go through estimates of annual camp disappearances, particularly taking into account the strengths and the weaknesses of refugee testimony. And I will move to a case study in Aksu, and I will conclude by describing a shift in Western transplant surgeons' attitudes over the last 2 years and the implications for U.S. policy. Now let's begin with a Kazakh doctor, Saragul Sautbay. I'm not good with the pronunciation there. She was employed as a Chinese language teacher, and Saragul made herself useful throughout her camp, following a camp-wide health check. That's what they called them, including comprehensive blood tests. Saragul was asked to sort out the camp's medical files. She noticed a colored check mark on certain files in the 23 to 35-year-old age range based on tissue typing. From Saragul's perspective, she only lacked the external list of individuals who would receive the organ. She was certain on this point. Now, several camp survivors noticed that following the blood test results, some prisoners were forced to wear colored bracelets or vests. There was no apparent logic to the color grouping, only that these people were in their late 20s and they were healthy. Witness testimony is far from perfect. Personal bias, trauma, and partisanship can influence the results, but I don't believe these elements are distorting the testimony here, and let me explain why. First, every refugee was from a different camp. There was no collusion. Second, outside of the rape room, all 20 camps had installed cameras and listening devices, and other than saying something like, "pass the plunger," speech did not really exist. In an environment of suppressed social contact and omnipresent and arbitrary interrogation or sexual abuse, humans compensate. Like starving animals, hearing becomes acute. Vision sharpens. Minute changes in their environment are keenly observed. Third, most camp refugees who I interviewed in Central Asia were Kazakh. With a relatively porous border and a nation state that occasionally lobbies China on their behalf, the Kazakhs view themselves as accidental prisoners. They don't like their Chinese overlord, but most Kazakhs are not loyal to the Uyghur cause. They had no motive to manipulate numbers to reach a particular result or to please me. Fourth, the interviews were purposely broad. Most witnesses had no idea that I was forming numerical estimates, and the majority were only dimly aware of organ harvesting in the first place. I wish to avoid false precision here. Even my most analytical witness, Ovalbek Turdakan, who recently escaped from Kyrgyzstan, could never determine the exact number of detainees in his camp. What emerged from their testimony is that there are two kinds of people who leave the camp early. The first group is about 18 years old on average. The announcement that they are going to work at a factory or perhaps in a Bing Tuan, a military-run cotton farm, is usually made during lunch. Light applause is often encouraged.
Light applause is often encouraged. Like, that just sounds like the most nightmarish thing ever. Like, there's, horrible atrocities happening to everybody. You're getting, like, given certain bracelets or marking or indicators to basically for the authorities to know where you're gonna go and where you're gonna end up, but it's not for you to know. The whole thing is like, there are just human atrocities happening over there in these prison camps that nobody's tracking on. Nobody is aware of. And I don't think that we'll ever find out, because short of people escaping those prisons that had spent some time there significantly and telling their, their first person experiences of it, the US is not going to end there with our military, like, clearing these prisons out like we did when we found the concentration camps after World War II. It's just not going to happen the same way. I just don't know how it could, That prospect is extremely bleak in my mind. And that really sucks, because there are people out there that are suffering at the hands of people like these. They're suffering extreme levels of barbarism that, people in the Western world couldn't possibly even begin to imagine. This stuff is happening in 2024.
This was very explicit from witness to witness. The age that the Chinese medical establishment prefers for organ sourcing. They are removed in the middle of the night. There is no applause. They are not to be mentioned again. There were a couple of outlier witnesses, but 90% of the witnesses were fairly consistent. 2.5% to 5% of the camp go missing exactly this way every year. Now, I don't have a plausible alternate explanation for this, and assuming there are 1 million in the camps, I estimate 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs are harvested annually. Let's go with a lower rate.
He said he estimates that 25,000 human beings are harvested for their organs annually there. 25,000 human beings every year just harvested for organs. That's like the type of stuff you imagine hearing about in those movies like The War of the Worlds or something. That's not something you anticipate other humans doing to other humans, This is why you have to have rules and laws to stop this type of thing from happening, because without rules and laws, if people just are run rampant and there's real tyranny, this is what you get. You get straight up organ harvesting, you get human atrocities beyond all comprehension, and nothing that anyone can do to stop it.
16, that Congressman Smith mentioned, estimated China's annual transplant volume at 60,000 to 100,000. Using the minimum estimate, let's assume that Uyghurs and Kazakhs can be harvested for at least 2 organs. That translates into a minimum of 50,000 organ transplants. That's the lion's share of China's annual transplant volume, and it's supplied by 25,000 dead people. Now, on the assumption that the Gulf states' organ tourists prefer Muslim donors who don't eat pork, the CCP has tried to capitalize on the switch from Falun Gong to Uyghur sources. At least one Chinese transplant hospital blatantly displays a Muslim prayer room and halal canteen on the web. Yet the logistical challenge of shifting away from the coastal area of China to Xinjiang, 4,000 kilometers away from the hospitals which foreign organ tourists prefer, required perfusion methods and Western technology. I'd welcome a question on that. It also required a streamlined infrastructure. And there's one example of that that's a very good one. Picture a re-education camp for 16,000 people. Picture a hospital, Aksu Infection Hospital, that performs organ transplants. Picture a second camp for 33,000 people constructed around that hospital. And picture a large crematorium. And the fact is, in Aksu, all these structures are less than a kilometer away from each other. RFA reporter Gulchera Hoja first noticed this anomaly, and witnesses can confirm it. A Uyghur conflict explained that the Aksu Infection Hospital was originally for SARS patients. In 2013, it was repurposed as a re-education hospital for extreme Muslim dissidents. The crematorium has a prominent Chinese sign. The air smells like burnt bones. A second Uyghur male confirmed that local workers constantly complained about the stench.
Bro, what? That is insane. People are constantly complaining about the stench. Yeah, no crap, because like everyone I know that's ever smelled that smell has said that you'll never forget it. I haven't personally. Everybody I know that has said that you'll never forget that smell. It's the worst smell you'll ever smell. I know a lot of people describe, a lot of like Civil War vets, you know, wrote down in their memoirs about the scent and the stench of that post-Civil War, because how else were they going to get rid of all of the, you know, thousands and thousands of corpses? They had to cremate them. And they just cremated them outside because that's the only way they could do it. And the residents of the area around this hospital were complaining about the awful stench. Well, that's probably because they were cremating an exorbitant amount of people after they had been harvested. That's insane.
Aksu Airport's human organ transport channel. That's an export-only fast lane to move human organs east. That's its only function. First hospital, Zhejiang province, is near Shanghai, not too far from Shanghai, and it's a designated big brother to Aksu Infection Hospital. And they report that their liver transplants increased by 90% in 2017. Well, kidney transplants increased by 200%.
Wow, I wonder where they got all those organs from. Just like they had a windfall of organs all of a sudden. Just everybody decided they wanted to donate that year. You know, I don't see how you could possibly rationalize that in any other way. I just don't, you know?
On March 1st, 2020, First Hospital performed the world's first double lung transplant on a COVID patient. This was an advertisement to foreign organ tourists that China was still open for business. I'll conclude, I'm over time, and I'll conclude with policy. Beginning in 2012, the Western transplant consensus was not to investigate China, but to engage with and lead the Chinese transplant industry to a soft reform. This consensus, however ineffective, acted as a brake on unified congressional action. In 2022, the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, ISHLT, decided to impose an academic boycott of China. The next year, the ISHLT asked me to present my research and the research of Robertson, Levy, Matus, and Kilgore at their annual conference, and I did that. Now, no transplant group has followed the ISHLT's lead at this time. Congress has a responsibility, I believe, to act on an ongoing human rights catastrophe, but they must also respond to ISHLT's courageous act. Realistically, the infrastructure of harvesting may be too robust to save Uyghur and Kazakh lives in the near term. Yet Congress can stop Beijing's ongoing attempts to normalize medical deviance, to spread this practice. And the passage of the Stop Organ Harvesting Act could galvanize the international transplant community to stop seeing research and investigation into Chinese harvesting as inflammatory or a deal breaker, but instead as a quest for justice on behalf of those young men and women whose only crime was that they were healthy. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to watch the entire video, but I'll put the link to this video in the description so you can watch the entire thing if you want. It was live streamed on March 20th of 2024 by the Congressional Executive Commission on China. In the meantime, I would like to read at least a little bit. The Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023. To combat forced organ harvesting and trafficking persons for purposes of the removal of organs and for other purposes. The act may be cited as the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023. It shall be the policy of the United States to combat international trafficking in persons for purposes of the removal of organs, to promote the establishment of voluntary organ donation systems with effective enforcement mechanisms in bilateral diplomatic meetings and in international health forums, to promote the dignity and security of human life in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted on December 10th of 1948, and to hold accountable persons implicated, including members of the Chinese Communist Party, in forced organ harvesting and trafficking in persons for the purposes of the removal of organs. Bottom line is that the bill was intended to dissuade people from wanting to participate in this or support it in any way, because they could revoke your visa, they could revoke your passport, they could, you know, put sanctions on you for different things. Like, they were trying to essentially slow this thing down back in 2023. If this is a bill that you think should be brought back to the Senate to reconsider, because it looks like it kind of died in the Senate, call your senator. That's all you can do. There's gonna be a lot of political change this year, a lot of stuff happening. I know there's a lot of other things that people are more interested in, like immigration, making more money, lowering the cost of groceries and gas, other things like that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.